Welcome, welcome everyone. This is Brittany Higginbotham with the Institute for Public Relations. We are so excited to welcome you this morning or evening, wherever you're joining us from, for an IPR webinar on a new report that IPR has conducted with Peppercomm on navigating the changing media landscape. During this webinar, we will have a discussion with one of our report authors, moderated by another of our report authors, and featuring representation and expertise from the media landscape as well. We will have Steve Cody, CEO of Peppercomm, speaking and sharing his insights, Tina McCorkindale, President and CEO of IPR, moderating, and Arun Sadhaman serving on the panel as well. And with that, I would like to just make a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available for playback on our website and YouTube channel within 48 hours. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to utilize the chat and Q&A box. We'll have a section for that at the end of the webinar. And if you have any tech difficulties, just message myself and I'll help you. We can get that sorted out. But with that, I just want to hand it over to our panelists today and get this webinar started.
Hi, Brittany. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here today. Just a note, I'm feeling a little under the weather. So if I'm not on my A game, that is my excuse this time. So hopefully it will be fine. So I'm very excited, as Brittany said, to talk about the study that we did about navigating the sort of media landscape and what we're seeing. And thanks to our partners at Peppercomm for working on this study. This is when we ask our trustees or we ask people about like what topics should we be thinking about, this one comes up quite a bit. Like, what do we see with the changing media landscape? So what we did with this study is we decided to look at the perspectives of 22 media relations professionals who are doing this day to day and what they're seeing as the changes. And then also 22 chief communications officers in companies to also see sort of what their perspectives are. And we thought that they would also be able to give us some insight into what they're seeing at the C-suite level and what they're seeing at the board level, while the media relations professionals think about sort of the strategy and the work into media relations. So I'm very excited to be joined by two trustees, Steve and Arun. And I had the privilege of just seeing Arun a few weeks ago in Singapore. But I'm going to ask them questions about their perspectives and expertise in this area. And we'll also drop a link to the chat to the study if you're interested in checking it out. All right, so first question, I just wanted to kind of level set to where we are. So if each of you could sort of set the stage of what you believe we are in our current media landscape, and if we've seen any changes in the past couple of years. So why don't we start with you, Steve, and then we'll go to Arun.
Sure. The words seismic and plethora come to mind, Tina. Not since Gutenberg invented the printing press, I think, has there been more seismic change in terms of information and the spread of information and the spread of misinformation and disinformation. So obviously, in the last couple of years, we've seen the rapid decline of the traditional newspaper, the rapid decline of local news media sources, the rise of all sorts of new sources of information, powerful sources of information, whether they be Substacks, podcasts. Obviously, Blue Sky is now on the scene, TikTok, all the other social media channels. So there's a richness, if you will, in terms of the various medium. But there's also quite a few minefields in terms of understanding how best to navigate those different news sources, how best to verify their veracity, and to make sure that certainly on the agency side that we're always in tune with stakeholder changes in terms of how they consume news, where they're going to either inform, educate, or entertain themselves. And also and when I know we're going to address this, and then I'll turn it over to Arun, but there's the rise of the skill set on the PR agency side, at least, of media buying and media planning. And earned, owned, and paid is certainly the watchword of the day. And the way in which our clients are evaluating results has also dramatically changed in the last couple of years, Tina.
Arun?
Yeah, thanks, Tina. So I think I agree with pretty much everything Steve said. I've lived now through, I feel like, a few cycles in terms of media's progress, if we want to describe it charitably. Um, but it feels like there's several cycles I've seen of boom and bust in terms of the media. And I can recall, for example, a few years ago when a lot of media companies in America primarily, but also beyond America, were attracting a lot of funding. And it was, really quite amazing to see how much VC money was going into media companies, and they were hiring lots and lots of people. And then that was followed by, some would say, an inevitable bust. And we are now in one of those periods, I feel, where there's a lot of journalists out of work, newsrooms are shrinking. I think that the big concern is that over the last 25 years, the busts get worse, and the booms are, I suppose, less positive. So the lows are lower, and the highs are also lower in the media business. And so there's kind of a steady, somewhat inexorable decline. I think the commercial model is really challenging for the media industry, around the world. I mean, there are some countries where the media is growing, but it's hard work. And so increasingly there's a blurring as well between editorial news and paid content in many channels and titles, and I think that's a real challenge. And as Steve mentioned, this kind of dispersion of influence, let's say, if not quite authority, but certainly of influence, I think is having a profound impact in terms of where people go to for information. And it seems clear that they don't go to the traditional sources of authority, the traditional media leaders anymore. They may go to individuals, they may go to TikTok influencers or people on Instagram and on YouTube. And whether these people are journalists or not, I don't know. That could just be a semantic debate, but there are journalistic standards at least in place when we're talking about some of these media companies. That may not be the case for social media influencers. But for consumers of the media, none of that stuff matters really, because that's where they're getting their information. And quite often it might be misinformation or even disinformation. So I see a lot of these trends converging, and I think they together they pose some significant challenges for future of the media.
Okay, both of you had mentioned some of well, Arun, you were just talking about social media influencers. You both mentioned disinformation, misinformation, and shrinking newsroom. So let's first talk about the shrinking newsroom. So in October 2024, Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern released their latest State of the Local News report. And in their previous report, which I love this report, when it comes out, I love reading it, that they predicted in their previous report that they launched in 2023 that by the end of 2025, next year, that the US would lose 1/3 of all its newspapers. But in the report they just released, they found that that has already been the case, that milestone has already been met. We are already down a total of 1/3 in the US of all our local newspapers. And that accounts to 3,200 newspapers, and 80% of the remaining newspapers that we have in the US are weeklies. So we're also seeing an increase in network news sites like Patch and Axios Local, and which seeing a shift towards sort of digital first news in some cities. But what we're also seeing is what we call a news desert, which means in some rural and small town areas that there is a complete lack of media coverage. And this means like they can't get access to community meetings, they don't know what's going on in their communities. So I would love to get your thoughts of this shrinking newsroom, because that's really what it is, a loss of newspapers and journalists to that effect, as you all said. So what are sort of your thoughts about this, Steve?
Sure. It's
How does it impact our work that we do as well?
sure. I was just going to start by saying it's disheartening to say the least. And I read a paragraph or two that said Donald Trump won the 2024 election with one of the smallest popular vote margins in U.S. history. But in news deserts, counties that lacked a professional source of local news, it was an avalanche. Trump won 91, that's 91% of these counties over his Democratic rival, according to an analysis by Medill. So as we all know, nature abhors a vacuum. So that vacuum is being filled by the national media. And as we know, a large percentage of the population tends to skew towards media that tells them what they want to hear. So the word objectivity is really becoming marginalized. And I think, in terms of filling that vacuum, we've seen no fewer than I think there was something like 1,300 websites that were funded by dark money. So there's all sorts of the scarcity, is beyond alarming, in terms of, what public relations can do is to make sure that we are dealing with authentic media. We're not dealing with bots. We're not dealing with AI generated publications. So I think more due diligence than ever is necessary in terms of reaching those key markets. And obviously they can also be reached, as Arun mentioned earlier, by the rise of influencers, by new, podcasters, by Axios, as you said. So there are new and different ways to reach those rural audiences, but it's a very real concern, and it's a very real challenge for both the country and for the public relations industry.
Arun, you also have when you worked at Provoke, you had a very international perspective. I know you did your annual conference in DC. Yeah, I also just saw you in Singapore, and you're also based in India. So sort of, are you seeing anything different in that front, or sort of what are your thoughts about this?
It is a little bit different in Asia because the whole local news landscape is really quite different. It differs on a country to country basis. And most Asian countries, are well served by national media. But the bigger markets, yes, certainly, you will see a lot of local media. India is a good example because India is, one of the most vibrant media markets in the world. And it is quite different. I mean, the interesting thing here, for example, is that local media is actually growing in India, and specifically local language media, so non-English media, is growing. The challenge, though, is that a lot of it is being driven, actually, to Steve's point, the sort of commercial basis for a lot of this growth is sometimes not as transparent as it could or should be. And there's often a blurring of lines between editorial content and paid content. And that can have serious, it can seem quite an innocent thing in a local newspaper to not disclose what's paid and what's editorial. But as you both know, and as I'm sure all of our attendees know, it can have quite significant ramifications to the functioning of the world's biggest democracy. In other Asian markets, I think local news is not so much of an issue, but I think the bigger issue is actually that we're seeing increasing government control of the media. People expected that the rise of digital and social media would, somehow offer an avenue to kind of overcome government media control, but that hasn't necessarily proven to be the case. Countries have actually, in some cases, brought in laws to regulate online media as well. And I think that is actually a bigger challenge for many Asian markets compared to, and there isn't necessarily a lack of local news, but there's a lack of independent, credible news across the board, actually. And I think that's a big challenge for countries that are kind of looking to develop economically. I mean, it's very difficult to do that without accurate and credible information.
Okay, so one of the things with the declining newsroom comes like less earned opportunities. And Steve, you had mentioned podcasts, except Arun, you said that you actually see more focus on local native language newspapers in India. What we found is that communicators are trying to do more with less. That what they said in our report is that, with the loss of journalists, that you also have to focus on less earned opportunities. So instead of having, here's a reporter that we had that was very knowledgeable about beat X or whatever it was, that they are usually short staffed, so they have to cover multiple beats. And there also is turnover, so you don't have that great relationship development that you used to have. Now, in some cases, I sort of socialized this with some individuals, and they were like, well, in our field, it's very technical, so we don't see as much turnover. So with the sort of challenges with some earned, that we did hear that people are having like greater numbers of paid and sponsored content. So, and Arun, you talked about some of the ethical issues where, you know, differentiating between paid content versus editorials and the labeling and that sort of thing. So I'd love to sort of hear about that overall, like are we seeing more like sponsored paid content? And if so, how do we sort of navigate this with challenges to authenticity, transparency, and honesty with these sort of outlets? So Arun, do you want to start?
Yeah. Sure. Thanks. It's a good question. It's quite a difficult question in a way because, unfortunately, I don't have any research, but something anecdotally I hear so often from people, comms people, agency people, or in-house comms people who tell me that because of shrinking newsrooms, and because of high turnover in the media and some of these trends, that essentially they are increasingly being asked to pay for news, to pay for placement of their stories. And even if it's not an outright transaction, there's some quid pro quo along the line somewhere. And you know, there's some sort of commercial relationship that's required. And it's really alarming. But it doesn't seem especially uncommon anymore. I think for the PR industry, they have to really adhere to the highest ethical standards in cases like this. You know, if they are paying for content, they have to ensure that it's clearly labeled as paid content, and they have to ensure that the content is as accurate and adheres to the same standards as their earned media content would. So that I don't feel that there should be any difference in the transparency and the veracity of information, whether it's paid or editorial content. I think there should be. I think the industry can play a more proactive role in insisting on disclosure of paid content and perhaps even pushing back when media are asking for that kind of a commercial element to these relationships. But ultimately, I think you know the problem is kind of a bigger one. It's bigger than the public relations industry because I think it speaks to the overall commercial health of the media. And ultimately, if people aren't willing to pay for news, and if companies aren't necessarily seeing much value in advertising the media, you know, it's not that surprising that we're ending up in a situation like this.
It's really challenging because if we're focusing more on paid content in a news atmosphere, then people who have more money and more funding are more likely to get highlighted in newspapers and others. So people who are less likely but could have more important content are not seeing the sort of play as much. So Steve, you want to give us maybe your thoughts on what you're seeing? Are you seeing more of a shift to like sponsored content, paid opportunities versus earned?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a sad but true fact. There are fewer journalists. There are fewer editorial opportunities. To your point, there are the big players who have the deep pockets, who can dominate, the paid portion of the media. And to Arun's point, it's really incumbent upon whether it's the in-house corporate communications department or the external public relations agency to not only make sure that that paid content is clearly identified, but to Arun's point, that it is factual, that it's authentic, that whatever company X is paying for, and I'll make up the publication, Bloomberg, that it is clearly identified as sponsored content. And certainly that's not always the case in the trades. And I see quite a few things, especially in the vertical trades, not necessarily the technical ones, because I'm not a technical guy. But in those vertical industry trades, where I do understand the content, it's a very slippery slope, and you really have to understand the business in order to delineate between what is earned and what is sponsored, because it can be so subtle and so public. So many publications are so strapped in terms of resources that maybe they don't have the time to fact check. Maybe they don't have the time to put those little words in, paid for by company XYZ. So it's very alarming, Tina, and I don't see it getting any better, which again makes it that much more incumbent upon the internal and external public relations people to be watchdogs. And that was always the role of the media. The role of the media was to be the watchdogs.
Right. And it's challenging if you put PR people in that role because they're advocating usually on the interest of their organizations and clients and so on.
Yeah.
So,
And the other point I was going to make is obviously, the higher paid journalists are unfortunately frequently the ones that are shown the door. So we are, interacting more and more with, recent college graduates who are covering 7 or 8 different beats, really, a mile wide and an inch deep. So there's so much more education and really preparation of a complete story. And I even hate to say this, but reporters are running complete stories that we provide to them. We do our very best to make sure they're completely objective. Obviously, they'll provide the client's point of view, but we try to also insert industry analysts and other, objective parties to make sure it does look balanced and it is, credible from an editorial standpoint.
okay, great. So I did want to talk a little bit about disinformation. You both mentioned it sort of in the beginning. IPR, we do a lot of work in the disinformation space by putting out guides. We put out one, like a guide for election disinformation. We also do an annual study looking at the state of disinformation. I feel like we should serve some sort of beverage with this webinar because we're not being very positive. Well, I have my coffee. But I feel like we're not being positive. And then I'm like, let's talk about disinformation. How worried should we be in the next couple years about disinformation and its impact on our industry?
I'll let you take that, Arun.
Thanks. I think we should all be very worried about misinformation and disinformation, if we're not already. I mean, I feel like we should already be extremely worried. I'm not sure if we can get more worried. We kind of all have our limits, and I suspect we may have already reached them. I think for the industry role, the problem is that the lower the sort of trust in, so the more that trust declines, the more it hurts everyone, right? So even if you're an agency or you're a company, you're advocating for a specific argument, point of view, or a case, disinformation and misinformation corrodes everyone and everything, and it just kind of, we end up in this sort of low trust environment that we're living in, where expertise is treated suspiciously, and sources of authority are viewed with much more skepticism than they used to be. So I think the industry can play quite a much more proactive role, I think, in addressing disinformation. Actually making sure, it starts with their own work, making sure that everything they put out is completely credible. I think PR people, comms people have a big role to play there in questioning kind of information that their own clients or their own agencies or whatever it is are putting out, making sure that as far as possible the whole story is being told rather than, let's say, a particular aspect of it, making sure even sometimes that all questions are being answered rather than just some of the questions that might be being asked. I think it requires just perhaps this kind of a mindset of responsibility for information in general, rather than a specific point of view. And I'm not sure I'm seeing that shift really. I know there's been a lot of talk in the industry about the need to address disinformation and misinformation, but on a case-by-case basis, um, I'm not sure we're actually seeing as much action as we could be seeing.
I think it's a great point, Arun, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's the responsibility of, again, in-house or agency people to almost be the investigative reporter and not take what a client is saying as fact. Push back and ask, well, what about this? What about that? Well, we did some research here and this doesn't ring true. So, um, we always like to position, every PR firm likes to position itself as a strategic counselor and not an order taker. In the past, that wasn't necessarily that important. I think it's absolutely fundamental now. Taking orders from a client organization and just passing them along or pitching them to the media as fact without pushing back, without asking the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. I think that's fundamental, especially to training our younger people who've grown up in a world of misinformation and disinformation, and this is their world. So why would the client be treated any differently than their news source? So I think it's a huge crisis that we need to better figure out. And I'm hoping that IPR and Page and some of the other associations and the larger agencies, and obviously each one of us need to step up and do a better role of pushing back and making sure what we're disseminating is as factual as we and authentic as we can possibly make it.
Yeah, and I'd just add that I think that that standard perhaps even needs to be higher for paid content and sponsored content
Yeah,
because there are fewer checks, and someone has to do the checking. And really, I think that the one of the benefits of the PR industry's growth over the last 20 years is that it now finds itself in a role of responsibility where it can actually have significant impact here, if it's willing to kind of, I think, actually make some hard decisions and as Steve put it, ask the hard questions.
Yeah, I think the other challenge though is that like we can do with just making sure information we put out is credible, accurate, and we're advocating for when the client asks us to do X. But we also have a lot of external sources that are trying to promote disinformation. So if you have a deep fake of your CEO who's doing something or saying something inappropriate, but it gets shared on TikTok and it's 100% not true, or if you have something that goes viral on some sort of subversive site that people have access to or WhatsApp messaging. I think that's also the other greater challenge, that there's a lot of disinformation that I would say the majority of disinformation that we don't have control over. That and But I'm just curious whether PR people are really prepared to deal with the magnitude of what's going to.
sure. The magnitude, it's a great question. It's so overwhelming, but there are so many tracking tools now that can give you an early alert to, a disinformation about your CEO, disinformation or misinformation about your product or service that you can get in pretty quickly and correct that, but the damage has been done. So, it's all about reputation management, and it's reputation management now on steroids. So it's so pervasive in terms of misinformation and disinformation that it's critical that we become, again, watchdogs in addition to investigative reporters. So I see the purview of the public relations practitioner as widening and broadening, and AI, which we haven't touched on, can be a big help in that. But it's not going away. It's not going to get any better. I'm sorry to be more of a downer, but it's just more pressure on us to make sure that we correct what's incorrect.
Interesting. Yeah, Arun, did you want to add something?
No, I was just going to say that someone in the chat has asked about WhatsApp in India in
Yes.
the context of misinformation, which is always one of my favorite things to discuss, but we can come to that when we get to the Q&A.
Yeah, we can. Let's put something. So there's actually a few questions I would say, Arun. relating to India. So you're going to be our spokesperson here and give us the whole insight. And we knew, and like we had talked about, or even the prelim call, we had talked about Prime Minister Modi's election in India and using influencers or messaging apps like WhatsApp. One of the challenges with WhatsApp, and it's not something that is usually I use WhatsApp to communicate with people who aren't in the US. But in places like India, it is one of the primary mediums of communication. And one of the challenges with WhatsApp is it's not necessarily public. So these end-to-end messaging groups that people are part of and get information from is also very high spread for disinformation. So Elizabeth Marsh posted a link about the declining press freedom in India. And then we also had a question about navigating India's changing landscapes and challenges with translating to different India languages. But the one I believe that you are referring to is that a lot of it now people realize is doctrine spreads misinformation is WhatsApp. I don't know if a lot of people actually realize that it's doctored information. He said we call it WhatsApp University in jest. How can a communication person fight disinformation on some of these messaging apps? So Arun, I just threw like 3 questions at you. So
Yeah,
there.
and
Just
all about
try to sift through those and come up with a great
sure,
answer.
all about a big country, which I would not dare to presume I can explain to anyone, much less Indians who are asking me questions. I think Alpana's question is really interesting about WhatsApp University because it's pernicious, it's widespread, it's hugely damaging. I've seen family members go from kind of normal thinking, trusting whatever they read in the media to just kind of spouting the most crazy theories because of the stuff that they receive every day on WhatsApp. And this is totally common now in India. Particularly, I think, I mean, I don't know if I'd love to see more research on it. It does seem to impact maybe older generations a little bit more. Um, but you asked me about Prime Minister Modi's campaign. I think the BJP has been very skilled in terms of how they use messaging on WhatsApp to seed, maybe certain theories, maybe certain ideas that they wouldn't necessarily want attributed to them in the traditional media, for example. And often it's not even them; it's proxies and so on. Um, I mean, it's quite a big question in terms of the whole Indian media landscape. But in terms of the WhatsApp situation, I was at an event in the World Economic Forum at the start of this year, and it was, global leaders discussing disinformation and misinformation. I think it was the former prime minister or president of one of the Nordic countries, and it was the head of a big media company. They were talking about all the different things that the media could do and all the tech platforms should do to address misinformation and disinformation. And I actually asked, well, what about WhatsApp? Because certainly in India, and I think probably in many countries, that's the number one source of fake news. And no one had an answer for how to deal with WhatsApp and by extension, how to deal with these sort of dark websites, private social networks, Discord, Reddit, and so on. So I think it's really challenging. I mean, there's talk. Some people think it needs to be regulated. For comms people, I have asked them how they deal with these WhatsApp crises, and it is just a question of it's the classic crisis thing of just being prepared, being ready, and deciding what you need to respond to, what you don't need to respond to, and then moving extremely quickly and just all of the usual crisis stuff on steroids. In terms of India's changing news landscape, translating into different Indian languages, I think, as in any diverse market, what's required is diverse insight. And that is starting to happen in India's comms world. You're now starting to see much more much more even spread of expertise around the country rather than just concentrated in the urban areas. But local insight is the biggest challenge in terms of managing India's local news landscape. And I think that is something that the industry needs to get a lot better at. And the first thing you mentioned was, India's press freedom rapidly declining. Well, it's interesting because you mentioned Modi, Prime Minister Modi's successful re-election campaign, and yes, definitely used influencers, messaging apps, rallies, a very sophisticated digital strategy. But I think any objective observer of the media would also argue that the decline in press freedom has also played a significant role um, in his electoral success as well. And that may change because his re-election was not the success that the BJP hoped for. And certainly since then, there's been a sense that the media is now much more empowered to be more critical of the ruling party than it was previously. So there you go. Is that enough on India?
Now you did an amazing job. That was
Thank
perfect.
you.
So,
I can
Steve, did you
cover
want to add
this.
something?
I can cover the same issues for the state of New Jersey if you like, Tina.
Yeah,
No, I
you
was going to say,
should.
yeah, a
What's
couple of
happening in
things.
Jersey City right now, Steve? Tell us.
I prefer not to disclose my location in New Jersey, as you know. A couple of things. As we were talking about the need for qualified, educated journalists. Obviously, journalism schools are probably feeling the pressure at the college and university level, but nonetheless, they're fundamental to maintaining an objective media press. At the same time, you have Elon Musk saying everybody on X is now a journalist. And a lot of people believe what he says. At the same time, I read recently that Joe Rogan extended interviews to both Trump and to Harris. Trump went to the studio for 3 hours, answered every question, and I believe that was shared over 300 million times. Kamala Harris insisted Joe Rogan come to her and that she would only do 1 hour, and he refused to go. So there's a huge missed opportunity with an emerging influencer. So that's just the take from New Jersey.
Nice. I think he's emerged. I feel like he's kind of a 3
He has
hours for
emerged.
any podcast is entirely too long. I'm just trying to get through my ebook right now. So here we
Yes.
go. So let's talk about also in the chat. Oh, by the way, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A or chat, either one. So in the chat, we've also talked about AI and translation. You all had mentioned AI. So we did ask about AI in the study. And when we asked currently about AI, it was very limited. A lot of people didn't say that they were using AI. Some were using it for like pitching. We also had some more sophisticated users who said that they were using it as a sandbox. So if I uploaded all of Arun's columns, he wrote while he was at Provoke, and then I could ask, like, please tell me what questions that Arun would most likely ask me in a press conference situation. So we have seen some of that, or drafting pitches. But most did not really say that they were using AI much. Now, when we talked about like what are we seeing 18 months from now or 24 months from now, that's when we started to get more people talking about the potential of AI in media relations. So for the question for both of you is, as we're seeing more integration and AI use in public relations, specifically in this case, media relations, our media, what we're doing with the media landscape, what are some maybe great benefits that we'll see, but also what are some challenges outside of disinformation? Because I feel like we've talked about disinformation that we may experience as well. Who wants to go first?
I'm using it in so many different ways, Tina. For example, a client that shall remain nameless is observing an anniversary and expects front page coverage, no surprise, in the Wall Street Journal. And so I was able to go to Perplexity, my go-to AI source, and I said, how many times has the Wall Street Journal covered an anniversary of a privately held company in the last 50 years? And the answer was 0. They only cover market movers. So I was able to go back to the client and say, this is not realistic. Here's what we think is realistic. At the same time, I can do some amazing, due diligence on competitors to a client or in a new business meeting, who are the players, what are their actual, shares of voices. It frees up a lot of time, especially at the junior level. All the administrative work, the editorial calendars, so much of that work can be freed up towards more strategic counseling, creating more authentic storytelling. So I think it's a big boon for those who understand how to use it. And as it becomes more intelligent, it has yet to capture my voice. I don't know if any sentient being could possibly capture my voice. That's probably a good thing. So everything I've tried to use, whenever Copilot asks me, do you need help? Every now and then I'll say yes. And what comes back sounds like, Robbie the Robot from whatever movie Robbie the Robot starred in.
That's fantastic. Arun, any thoughts?
So it's interesting. I've actually been interviewing people over the last couple of weeks in Asia, comms heads, about their use of AI and what they're planning to use AI for next year. And none of them mentioned media relations. They
Interesting.
talked about translation, they talked about content creation. So you could potentially say they are doing like first drafts of press releases, which I guess counts as media relations. And they talked about things like maybe design concepts, um, uh, but none of them, talked about really, none of them have mentioned, for example, researching journalists. Which again, it seems like an obvious way to use AI to me. I think media monitoring in general, AI brings significant benefits. I would imagine measurement and evaluation as well. I think a lot of that can only benefit from being more automated. And you'd like to think that you could get to more targeted, more efficient media relation strategies. I mean, one of the things the media always complains about is, getting misdirected pictures and that kind of stuff. And you would think that having AI as an assistant would be helpful um, in that regard. But yeah, it doesn't seem to be happening that often. So just in terms of the challenges, I would say they're the usual challenges I think that we are familiar with when we talk about AI, right? So I think there's the need for transparency in its use and disclosure, um, avoiding bias, even when it comes to researching which, for example, which journalists you should be speaking to and so forth. And there's, of course, privacy concerns. And I think probably the other one I'd mention is skills. I just think there needs to be a lot of upskilling in terms of using AI. I think at this point, when we're talking about comms teams and even agencies, although I suspect agencies are further ahead, I still think there are far more questions than there are answers. And people are still relatively intimidated by just the proliferation of AI tools, by the hype, and also by, frankly, all the talk of how 30% of jobs are going to be automated. So we can move from this perspective of AI being a threat to something that will actually help. Then I think we might start to see it being used more for some of these day-to-day tasks.
Yeah, I definitely see. I spoke at a department meeting in front of a couple hundred comms people a few months ago for a company, and I asked them the question of who was using it, and their organization had adopted Copilot. And, some of the comments were some people used it all the time, and others found it kind of challenging to use or weren't really sure. So I think there definitely is a continuum. For me personally, I'm more of a, if I was going to use generative AI, I find ChatGPT to be a little stronger for me than Copilot, even though I do have a Copilot subscription. I agree with Steve, where he said it makes him sound like Robbie the Robot. It sounds like a ridiculous person that I would never talk like this sort of person, but I feel like ChatGPT understands me more. But I think that's also very early on. So
Yep.
2 years from now,
Yep.
right? Who knows what we're going to have? Steve, I know you'll appreciate the story. I was listening to NPR this morning, and there is a Jesus bot that one of the Catholic churches had launched. And so it's like an AI Jesus, and you could ask Jesus for advice, an AI Jesus, and it would give you like answers about, and I was like, this is what's going to happen. Who knows what the next like 3 years will be with what we can do with AI and how we use it. So I thought you
No,
would like that
yeah,
story.
yeah. No comment.
It was great there, but that was funny. The funniest part was at the end. It was on NPR. The funniest part was at the end where they were like, they're not planning to roll it out to other churches and they're looking at art museums to include it. So I'm like, this is so great with AI and what we're seeing. Um, just one comment that IPR for our research, we did release a guide to like citing AI and how to include AI because and it was kind of mixed. Some people said you don't need to cite when you use AI, and it's sort of implied, but we, for research purposes, want to err on transparency, where we do say if we have used it to be uh, if we have used it in some way for research or summaries or whatever. Erica in the chat said that she found ChatGPT to be helpful with generating questions for CEOs for upcoming interviews.
Yep.
And she'll say she asked it to scan what CNBC reporter has been asking CEOs in the past
Yes.
6 months. Steve, you mentioned Perplexity. I will also say Gamma is really great for creating PowerPoint presentations.
Yep.
Claude AI is another great platform.
Yeah,
Are
I
there,
love Claude.
yeah, Claude's
Claude is
great.
good.
Yeah. Are there any other platforms that come to mind for either one of you?
No, Claude is, I mentioned,
No.
I left out Claude, but Claude's terrific for kicking off brainstorming sessions for us. So it does a lot of the spade work that would have taken hours, perhaps, and immediately spews out what we need to know in terms of prospective client, the landscape, what's worked, what hasn't worked. So that's been huge for us as well.
Yeah. So a couple more that I've been kind of experimenting with a little bit is Granola, which is, I think, relatively new, and it's for meetings and notes. And it seems to be the best I've used for transcription so far. And it also helps you, like you can ask it questions of your meetings and so on. And I find it's quite useful compared to, I know there's a lot of meeting note takers, but this one seems to be the best one I've used so far. And then there's one called Opinionate, um, which I haven't actually used that much myself, but I've heard a couple of people mention it to me. And apparently that's very good for providing both sides of an argument.
Mhm.
So I do know some people who use it with their spouse,
Oh,
which is,
And
it could
what's
well
the
be of
success
use.
rate, Arun? What's the success rate with that in
I
terms
have no comment on that, Steve.
There's a couple questions in the chat. One I can answer. Hi, Angela. Angela Dwyer asked in the Q&A about thoughts on sponsored content or AI generated content influencing audience trust. We have featured this a couple times in our research letter where academics have looked at differences between sponsored content and human generated content. When you tell people that the content was AI generated, they definitely score it less trust and less just feelings toward it. If you tell someone that AI content was actually human generated, like you basically lie to them in an experiment, then they do value it greater. So absolutely AI content and AI created content, what we have seen at this time is that it is less trustworthy as perceived by the audience. So that is definitely something that has been found in the research. Um, and
Oh, by
then
the
let's,
way, I should just mention Notebook LM. That's another, I
oh
think that's quite
yes.
a well-known AI platform that seems to be extremely popular these days in terms of, especially if you kind of put in research reports and you'll
Mhm.
get a podcast out.
Yes.
Kind of amazing.
Spoiler. So we did actually, Michael Charenson he said, I fed your report to Notebook LLM and it created a
Yeah.
podcast of the report. And it was like a female and a male summarizing the study and asking each other questions. And everything in it was accurate. It was
Nice.
like 100% accurate. It was way better than what Steve and I would have been able to produce. It wouldn't have been as funny. Like if
No,
Steve and I did our pod, it would have been actually pretty funny, but
that's a good question. When will AI develop a sense of humor, Tina?
I don't know. Hopefully never. That way we have some advantage to it.
Yeah, well, I was speaking to a comms head today, actually. Apparently, his CEO had said to him, "Oh, well, I guess I'm not going to need you to draft my speeches anymore because I can just use AI."
Uh,
But luckily, he said, "Yeah, but I understand your sense of humor. I can, and AI can't do dad jokes. So,
no,
Right.
thank
you know,
God.
thank God for CEOs everywhere, I guess."
With bad jokes. Okay, so there's we had mentioned that there's less earned opportunities in some sectors. Some sectors said that there is not. And we have more sponsored opportunities. But there's a couple people who've talked about this. So I just want to kind of summarize what I'm seeing in the chat. One was about best practices for pitching in a changing media scenario. And let me see if there was another thing. Um, but hmm, I don't know if you would have the expertise to speak to that. Any thoughts about like pitching and how that sort of changes with what we're doing?
Well, I think the basics haven't changed at all in terms of really understanding a reporter or an editor and what she or he has written in the past, what their hot buttons are, um, personalizing the relationship if at all possible, following them on social channels, liking and sharing some of their articles, breaking through to them, asking them what topics they're working on in the future, where one of our clients might fit in. So I do think relationships are more critical than ever. They're harder to create, but they're absolute gold when you can do that. And we certainly train our employees to do that. And whenever we can, we do a virtual lunch and learn with a different reporter from a different publication or, broadcast radio, et cetera, to just spend 15 or 20 minutes sharing with our employees how they're dealing with AI, how they're dealing with the shrinking newsroom, how they're dealing with owned and advertising. So the more we can be educated, I think the better outcome we'll have in terms of those media relationships and, the kind of articles that our clients are hiring us to produce.
Okay, great. Podrick did ask in the chat that like what role should comms people play in closing the gap on media literacy? And I'll just say IPR, we've always been a big advocate for media literacy. And that's one, and they also call it information literacy as well. And one of the challenge, sorry, my dog wants to get down. One of the challenges, though, is that when we think about disinformation, media literacy, that's not necessarily something a lot of agencies or organizations put in their professional development programs.
Yeah.
However, what we do find is that when you train people on information literacy, media literacy employees, that they become better critical thinkers, they're less likely to share disinformation. But I don't really see many organizations doing it. So I didn't know, Steve or Arun, if you had any thoughts about that.
I believe it should begin at the middle schools, right through the high schools and in colleges. That's the missed opportunity, and I think that gap is widening with each passing year.
Yeah,
So I don't know who would fill that gap, but that's where I would focus if I had the wherewithal, Tina.
yeah. It does feel sometimes like the ship has sailed. Um, And it's nice to think that comms professionals can help close the gap on media literacy, but the concern is that I think the gap is too big
Yeah.
um, now. One point I would like to make is it's not really related to that question necessarily, but we haven't mentioned it yet. But I do think that comms people also internally need to be educating their boards and their CEOs much more proactively and much more effectively about the way that media influence and authority has changed. Because I think even in their report, there was the quote that there's sort of a 2004 mindset when it comes to
Yeah.
boards.
Yes.
And I think that's why you get these situations where um, people are surprised. CEOs often and business leaders and board directors are surprised when Donald Trump wins the presidential election. But really, I think if you're following media trends, then maybe it shouldn't be such a surprise. And I think that's a big role that comms people should be playing internally within their own organizations as
Yeah, I
Yes.
would agree. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Tina.
Yeah, so one of the things that Rune referred to is in the study, we did see that CCOs said that there were varied perspectives on sort of the media landscape from the perspective of their C-suite and the board of directors. And some said that their CEOs were very adaptable to media changes, but others said that they were not. It seemed that there was a hierarchy, like the C-suite was a little more in tune with the current media landscape, and the board of directors it's like the distance, we're not as adept. And the comment that one said is that they described it as a 2004 mindset in 2024. But what was very consistent was that the CCO was responsible for educating both C-suite and the board on sort of the changing media landscape. And whether not only is it that you have the shrinking newsroom, this is maybe why coverage is affected, but also here's some other sort of different channels that would maybe more beneficial or maybe more target for your audience. So,
Yeah,
all right.
the way I
Let's see.
interpreted that, Tina, is that there are still far too many boards of directors that are populated by people who look like me. Um, and I think that does a disservice. I think every director is responsible for every part of the business that they are overseeing. So if they don't understand the current media landscape, A, shame on them, but B, it also tells me the CCO has not done a good enough job, or it's being blocked by someone else in terms of their coming to those, whether they're quarterly or twice a year meetings of the boards, and really explaining this is what's going on. These are the possibilities. This is where our strengths are. This is where the weaknesses are. This is where we could be hit. The board of directors need to know that, and the CCO needs to impart that information and education. So that's a problem.
Okay, so here's my last question. All right, it's time to look into our crystal balls, gentlemen. So here's our crystal ball. What are you seeing is the future? What do we need to think about from a communicator perspective for the next like 18 months to several years? What do we need to be on top of and think about as we move forward?
I'm passing to you, Arun.
well. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I struggled with this question. I mean, not so much the 5 years one, the 18 months one, I really struggled with because, um, I mean, yes, you could probably say that AI will be more commonplace um, in 18 months. You can, you know, newsrooms will probably shrink more. And I think all of the skills we've talked about on this call will become more important for PR pros in 18 months. But I really think actually it's in 5 years where we'll start to see kind of fully integrated AI is kind of integrated into all aspects um, of not just media relations, but honestly, media production and distribution as well. And for better and for worse, I think we will see much more personalization of information. And that goes again, both from a media perspective, but also from a comms perspective. Um, I think in 18 months, hopefully, we will see PR becoming genuinely more integrated. I know that it has become more integrated over the last 15 years, but that seems to have accelerated over the last 3 to 5 years. And so I suspect that will kind of speed up even more over 18 months. And I think, honestly, from another 18-month perspective, a lot of crisis management. I think there will be a lot of crisis. If you remember the last Trump presidency, it seemed like an era of permanent crises for the C-suite and for corporates. And I think that will persist.
Yeah, I would echo that. Global uncertainty is now a daily occurrence, and staying focused is and internal communications and employee engagement more critical than ever. We don't have to, focus on the anxiety and the isolation and the depression and all the things that workforces are being faced with around the world right now. So I think, to Arun's point, the next 2 years are going to be very telling in terms of what will Trump do? What will the impact be on freedom of the press? How will PR firms, how will corporate communications departments, will they change? Will they adapt? Will they just say, well, this is the way it is and we'll follow his lead? There's so much uncertainty. You have all these different wars breaking out. So on a positive note, things are pretty stable in the state of New Jersey right now, Tina.
I was gonna say, you all have to say something positive. Like, next 4 years, all crises, uncertainty, depression. My gosh. All right, so that's good. So basically the wrap up is the state of New Jersey is fine. Okay,
The
good.
Garden State.
All news is local. So there you
Yes,
go.
there
All
you go.
news is local. I wanted to thank you both for being here today. We greatly appreciate it. Brittany said that this webinar will be available and she will also send out a link. Brittany, is there anything else I missed before we sign off?
No, that covers it. Thank you both, or thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful holiday season and look forward to seeing you participate next time. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Steve, for
Thanks,
joining us.
Tina.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Tina,
Arun.
and hope you feel better soon. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Appreciate
Ditto.
that. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Arun.
Cheers.
See
Bye.
ya.